Alrighty, I have the pleasure of being joined once again with Representative Abigail Salisbury from District 34 in the state of Pennsylvania. I had the pleasure of speaking with Representative Salisbury back in April. We actually first ran into her at a hearing in Darlington, Pennsylvania. We didn't get a chance to really chat there, but I wanted to do a follow-up here to discuss a little bit of an update as far as what's been going on with the East Palestine derailment and how that's been affecting residents in Pennsylvania as well. And then Abigail's been working on some legislation in the Pennsylvania House regarding the railroads, as well as do a little bit of a follow-up on some things we discussed last time regarding taxpayer money being used to, help fix infrastructure that is, belongs to or did belong to these railroads. But we'll start off first with the kind of everything that's been going on in East Palestine. We've had some new developments regarding the EPA, kind of backtracking on whether this was a controlled burn or actually an open burn. We've got more evidence coming out about the air testing that was being done in residents' homes being inadequate for all this sort of stuff. And I've spoken directly with residents in Pennsylvania who have had a hard time getting access to some of the same resources that may be available to folks in Ohio. I guess, first off, what has been your reaction? It's been, about a month and a half since we last spoke, to everything that's kind of unfolded regarding this derailment since we last spoke.
So I do just want to say that as I sit in Harrisburg today, all of the outdoor events were canceled and moved inside because we have such smoky air and poor air quality from fires that are happening in Canada. Mm-hmm. So for people who don't think that air can waft with harmful chemicals to the extent that it can harm people who are not in a small mile radius of a controlled burn, it's, I think, a eye-opening, sinus clogging revelation to find that you can be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and have your air filled with smoke from Canada. So it's definitely something that impacts people from a broader area.
That's a very good point, and I'll point out too that that's significantly further than 1 to 2 miles away from those fires. We talked a little bit last time about that imaginary 1 to 2 mile bubble, yep, where apparently all of these chemicals were contained within. But continue, go ahead.
Yeah. So we are in the middle of budget month right now in Harrisburg. So I'm on the Appropriations Committee, which is what puts the budget together for the state of Pennsylvania. I will tell you that I have not received any requests. We have everybody and their brother shows up in Harrisburg leading up to budget month and in budget month asking for money to be appropriated for certain things. I have not received a single request for any appropriations for anything associated with derailment or for anything to treat any conditions that anyone might have had from the derailment. I've not received any advocacy emails. I've not had anybody come to my office, either here in Harrisburg or in my district office in Braddock. It's just not something that people have been asking for. Mm-hmm. I am on the Environment Committee, and I am hopeful that we can more fully fund that committee, the Department of Environmental Protections that we have in the past. I know Chairman Vitale of the Environment Committee has asked for a lot more funding to do things from everything from researching whether water quality in streams is appropriate to looking at damage caused by methane coming out of uncapped wells, everything like that. But it has not been really funded to the degree that I would hope. Gotcha. But yeah, it's been interesting to me that I haven't received a single request for any budget item. I've received budget requests from racehorse organizations, anything you can think of.
Right.
But nothing related to train derailments or controlled burns.
And now, is this because now I know your district, it's not very far from the area. It's obviously not, right on the Pennsylvania border there, such as, the folks who probably represent Darlington. Is it that residents are not requesting assistance, or is this just like it's not getting, residents may be reaching out to their representatives and it's not getting through to the right people? Because it's a little surprising to hear that no one has been raising the alarm here, because I know I speak with residents on both sides of the state border on a weekly basis And I know that many of them are still expressing concerns over this. I'm just curious where you think the misconnection might be.
I think people in my district are still interested in it, but I think unfortunately the news cycle has moved on.
Hmm.
I know you guys are still on it. I do hear people still talking about it and see that on social media. I know in the community where I live, they've taken up collections to bring items to the Ohio border up there. And I know that people who live closer to the border, I think, are still having it much more on their minds. But I
Right.
feel like with a new shooting or high profile drama coming out practically every day, it's hard to hold the public's attention sometimes. But I know that there are people who are still focused on this issue for sure.
Hmm. Absolutely. I guess let's move on a little bit to the new legislation that you're putting forward because one thing that this derailment did do, at least initially when this occurred, was kind of raise awareness of the issue of railroads in the United States, all of these different chemicals and whatnot traveling through small communities and big communities across the country. Initially, we heard some talk about federal legislation. It's kind of gone, like you said, it's out of the news cycle now. I haven't heard much about the legislation. A couple weeks ago, there were some rumblings that maybe they were making some progress, but haven't heard much about it since. I've kind of made the comment before that the longer we wait on this, the less likely that something is going to happen. But thankfully, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, it seems like you all in the House have made some progress with a recent bill that actually just passed through the House, House Bill 1028. You, I believe, are a co-sponsor on the bill. Do you want to outline a little bit of what's included in that new legislation that just passed the House?
Yeah, so Representative Matzi was the prime sponsor of this bill. He authored the legislation. I'm signed on as a co-sponsor of it. I was really happy to see it moved out of committee really quickly and was passed finally in the House. So now it, of course, has to go to the Senate. Basically, it's some common sense things that were being asked for on both sides from Republicans and Democrats. So although it was Democratic legislation, they were things that had been raised for several months by Republican representatives too. So I'm hopeful that it'll get bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, we're looking at things like limiting the length of trains to 1.5 miles, which limiting something to 1.5 miles was kind of surprising to me, but basically you could have 3 mile long trains, and my understanding from the research I've done is the longer the train is, the more likely there is for more likely a derailment would be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important. One of the things that I saw a number of Republican representatives mention is that in their communities there aren't overpasses. There are just trains that stop in the middle of town, and they can sit there idling for as long as they want. They can block emergency vehicles getting from one side of town to the other, so it limits the amount of time that they can do that. Something else I also think is important is specifying a minimum staffing on the trains themselves. Sometimes there might only be one person on there, and so if something goes wrong, they can't abandon the train to go and investigate what's going on. So you have to have at least 2 people, which to me seemed like common sense, but apparently we have to legislate that. Also, there's something on there that would require the railroad companies to allow union representatives to do safety inspections for their membership because, of course, many railroad employees are unionized. And up until now, apparently there was an issue that the railroad companies would call police and say that the union reps were trespassing so that they could not do certain types of inspections. So there's there's some other things in the bill, but those are just some sort of bullet points, if you will, of what goes on there. And I think it's common sense stuff. I mean, nothing there is wild from my perspective.
Right. I when I read through the bill, I actually I was surprised. You mentioned trains. I think you said 1.5 miles long. I think it's like 8,500 feet, and I was like, I wonder how many trains fall above that. I did a little bit of research. According to the American Association or the Association of American Railroads, I don't have the exact number, but it looked like somewhere between 10 and 25% of trains in the U.S. are actually longer than that 8,500 feet threshold. So that will have an effect, as many folks know, a lot of trains do travel through Pennsylvania that are headed anywhere into the kind of the East Coast. So that if this were to pass the Senate, would definitely have a big impact. I guess as far as the blocking of railroad crossings you mentioned. Obviously, that is a big concern. In East Palestine, for example, this is over in Ohio, but only one of their crossings has a bridge over it. So if a train does just get stopped in town, the whole town is essentially cut in half minus one bridge. But to your point, many localities in Pennsylvania don't have a bridge over them. What sort of enforcement measures will be in place to essentially make sure that the railroads don't just say, okay, yeah, here's a new rule, but this, this isn't a big, this doesn't apply to us, essentially. How can you guys enforce this at the state level?
So in theory, you would be able to fine the railroad because corporations tend to respond to being financially penalized, although at a certain point, sometimes they do just incorporate it into their business model as a cost of doing business. But in theory, we would be able to have that consequence. Now, should this pass the Senate, I have every expectation that it will be subject to a legal challenge from the railroads based on the Interstate Commerce Clause, because the federal government, of course, in the Constitution has the ability to regulate interstate commerce, which is a pretty broad, sweeping provision in the Constitution because almost everything is considered interstate commerce. But I'm happy to see that you do what you can do. And we are not federal legislators, but we are legislators, and so we can at least try to implement this in Pennsylvania. Right. So the objection that we've received from various industry groups or the railroads themselves is that they believe this is unconstitutional under the Interstate Commerce Clause. So I think that there's every likelihood that the first time someone tries to levy a fine for this, should it get passed through the Senate, then there will be a constitutional challenge. But I think it's important to at least show that we have the intention to be doing something about this. And I'm hopeful that the federal government passes something similar.
Right. So I would imagine you'll unfortunately potentially run into this issue with some of the other items in the bill regarding length, regarding even the union representatives being able to be involved with inspections. I'm assuming that this would probably fall into the same category where it could easily be challenged in this way.
Yeah, I would expect that it'll immediately be legally challenged because they have the legal resources to bring such a suit fairly simply.
Right. And unfortunately, as we saw back in December of 2022, when the federal government has had an opportunity to back some of the, specifically the unions in this case, we saw very quickly what, in my opinion, what the Biden administration essentially single-handedly just kind of squashed the unions' rights to be able to actually go through and have a strike. One of the main issues that they were kind of focusing on was safety, in addition to some paid sick leave, which seems reasonable in my estimation as well. So we'll see. Have you had any discussions? I know this is your first term in this state legislature. Has anyone in the Pennsylvania delegation at the federal level expressed any interest in this bill, to your knowledge, that you all are working on, or have any insights into some federal legislation? Because ultimately it seems like that's what really needs to happen. I commend you all in Pennsylvania for trying to do something, because again, at the federal level, I really haven't seen much of anything. From where you stand, have you heard anything about federal legislation moving forward, or has anyone who represents Pennsylvania expressed interest?
I know, so my district is half Chris DeLuzio and half Summer Lee. So I know that Chris DeLuzio has definitely been working on this issue. I believe Congresswoman Summer Lee, who's actually my predecessor in this seat, she had this seat before me. I believe that she held a press conference about train safety as an environmental justice issue. But I do occasionally hear that they're working on things. Things sometimes take a long time to move along. I'm actually kind of surprised that this legislation moved through as quickly as it did, and it shows the priority there. In terms of the union aspect, I know I can't speak it from a federal level because I don't have that experience. I can tell you the Democratic caucus in Pennsylvania is aggressively pro-union. I personally voted for the steelworkers to unionize employees when I worked at the University of Pittsburgh. So we just had a union rally a couple days ago here in Harrisburg. So I think that was a really mission critical part of it for us, is enabling the union to be able to protect its own employees.
Gotcha. One last thing I noticed that was in the legislation, and then I'll move on to one last thing I'd like to touch on from our previous conversation, was information on Wayside Detector improvements as well. Obviously, the Wayside detectors are something that we all kind of learned about with this Ohio derailment again. This legislation would essentially add some additional requirements for those. Do you want to outline that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, let me bring up my bullet point so I can make sure to hit
Yeah,
that.
you're fine.
But yeah, the I think one of the issues with the wayside detector systems is that the PUC, which is Public Utilities Commission, wasn't necessarily communicating with PennDOT on some of those issues, and then also um, when you had an understaffed train, they didn't necessarily have the ability to stop and take care of anything, even if they knew that there was an issue. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that like part of the reason that all of these work together in the legislation is that each thing is kind of conditioned on the next thing. So
Right.
if you don't have enough people on the train, regardless of what you might be detecting, you might not be able to do anything about it because there's nobody else to watch the train if you go check.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the issues that was mentioned to me, for instance, is if there is a detection that there is something wrong, you would have to stop the train and have one person essentially, watching the helm, if you will,
Right.
and use that analogy. And then the other person would be able to go and decouple a car that is problematic. But if you only have one person, then they wander off and there could be a runaway train.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you have a detection of the problem, you don't have anyone to be able to go and take care of the problem. So I think a lot of these issues are interrelated. So if you fix one,
Mm-hmm.
like the detectors, that doesn't necessarily fix everything else if you don't have enough people who are there, or there's a possibility, of course, that things could be disabled or not working properly. And if the unions are not allowed to inspect and make sure that their members are working in safe environments,
Mm-hmm.
then it just sort of all snowballs, I
Right.
suppose.
No, that makes sense. During our last conversation, we spoke quite a bit about back when you were, a local representative in your local government, about money that your local community was needing to have to, essentially there was a bridge in the community that the railroad owned, and they were trying to transfer ownership of it to your borough, I believe.
Yeah.
And that kind of led you, once you became a state representative, to look into how much money was actually being spent by the state government on these sort of situations where the state government essentially is being put in a position where they need to upgrade this infrastructure that was owned by railroads, in some cases maybe still is owned by railroads. Can you outline, I guess, a little bit of backstory for folks who maybe didn't catch that interview, and then what you have since learned in a hearing that happened, I believe, back in April?
Yeah, so Swissvale Borough, where I was on council, there's a closed down bridge. PennDOT shut it down because every time it rains, pieces of it fall off. Um, it was built pre-World War One. It was actually built the same year as our borough building, which collapsed in 2020. So we're really having great luck with
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
But yeah, the bridge carries traffic over the railroad tracks. So the bridge does not carry the train. The train goes underneath. And it has become the policy of the state of Pennsylvania that they call them highway bridges, are to be transferred to the local municipalities. But when we talk about municipalities, I'm not talking about the city of Pittsburgh or something. Swissvale Borough has 9,000 people. I live in an area where we have very balkanized local government. So my smallest community only has 450 people. My largest community has just over 13,000. These are not large cities that are able to take things on like that. They have part-time, practically volunteer local government. We got paid $181 a month to serve on council. And then all of a sudden we're supposed to be negotiating with railroads. So realistically, the PUC gave me the answer that they just bring the parties together. It felt like a very kumbaya answer that they gave
Mm.
me at the budget hearings during appropriations hearings. And I said, realistically, when you're telling a 9,000 person borough with essentially a volunteer local government that they are required to be responsible for a multi-billion-dollar corporation's infrastructure, you're taking a side. And they
Right.
said, we're being neutral, we're doing this, we're doing that. But they're not.
Right.
So I had asked, we have a great research tool here in Harrisburg. We can ask any question. Chat GPT has nothing on us to be able to ask questions. So I asked the question of how much money we're spending on this. They told me $26 million was the figure, and that has been higher in the past and maybe higher in the future because more and more infrastructure is deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
But that is what is being spent of Pennsylvania state tax money on these bridges, because as a municipality, when the PUC brings everybody together for these wholesome conversations, they tell you, well, don't worry about the expense of maintaining this bridge that we're going to force you to own. We will give you state grant money to be able to help pay for it. Mm-hmm. So that state grant money is Pennsylvania taxpayers' dollars that are then being redirected into municipalities to pay for infrastructure that used to be owned by a private corporation.
Interesting. It seems like you could spend a fraction of that $26 million on hiring like a negotiator who can work on behalf of the state, and these local boroughs can like essentially use this person free of cost to help negotiate with the railroad. That seems like it'd be a better use of the money, and maybe in some cases you can force the railroad, whose the only reason these bridges exist is because of their right of way through the tracks.
Even if you had that, I mean, we had our borough solicitor, who's our attorney, who I think just had a hard job because we had 3 lawyers out of the 7 council members, and we all sort of had our 2 cents all the time. But we had a very good solicitor, but the reality is there is no negotiation, because a negotiation requires some degree of equal footing, requires some degree of good faith on both sides. And so when the PUC told me that they feel that their role is to be an arbitrator or a mediator, and I said, my husband is a mediator. My husband's also an attorney like me, and he's a mediator. That's a neutral middle party. Or if you go to an arbitrator, same thing, neutral middle party. But when the PUC has its thumb on the scale, saying that these local communities have to take on these bridge ownership responsibilities, that's not a neutral party. That's not a mediator or an arbitrator. That's a bought judge, in my opinion. So there's no chance of having a fair shake. So I'm not on council anymore, but obviously I still live there, so I still keep up with what's going on. They still haven't come up with a final plan from what I've been able to see. And the railroad told the community that once there is a final deal, from that day, it'll still be another 3 years before the bridge is rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt higher so that they can run double stack trains.
Right. So for the meantime, for the next 3 years, you all have a bridge that has pieces falling off of it, and is clearly a safety hazard in the community. And when it gets rebuilt, it's rebuilt to specifications that benefit the railroad further by making it higher. That's pretty outrageous. Not surprising. I'd be very curious. I'm sure, if this is happening in Pennsylvania, if you're watching this from somewhere else, this is probably happening in your state as well. So definitely some good things to look into, to ask your state reps about, regardless of where you are. I guess to wrap this up a bit, you've been in your position now you started at the beginning of this year, right? So about six months.
February 21st.
All right.
So I've only been in office like 3 months. Yeah.
So you've been in office for 3 months now. You've been there in an interesting time with what happened, in close proximity to your community with the derailment in Ohio. You've been working on some of this railroad legislation. Some of it may seem like a futile effort, considering what you're saying as far as the potential challenge that could come in court over this, and it needing to get kicked up to the federal level. What are your just overall thoughts on this so far? You're seemingly trying to make a difference on some of these things, and I commend you for doing that. But it seems like this is something that the federal government really needs to take much more seriously. I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I think that, from a state level, I've spoken to the Lieutenant Governor, Austin Davis, about this issue, because I said that at a state level, we need to address why it is the policy of the PUC in Pennsylvania to make municipalities take over responsibilities that should be the responsibilities of private multi-billion dollar entities and not the taxpayer. That's something that needs to happen from a policy setting level. And also from a federal level, obviously the Interstate Commerce Clause is always going to be invoked whenever you try to do a state level commerce rule. So you're going to have to do a lot of litigation that may be costly and will be certainly used as a delay tactic. So I would very much encourage federal elected officials to be doing something. I know that Senator Fetterman has looked into some of this. He's had obviously a number of health issues that have affected him, and I think that may have slowed some of his progress of being able to work on this issue. But as I said, I am encouraged by the fact that Congressman DeLuzio and Congresswoman Lee have shown an interest in this, both from just a sort of pragmatic infrastructure approach as well as an environmental justice issue. But really, it needs to be coming from the federal government to avoid the burden of having a patchwork of 50 different regulatory systems that then can easily be challenged in court.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And, especially considering the potential consequences when things go wrong, as we've clearly seen here on both the Ohio side and the Pennsylvania side of what happened with the East Palestine derailment, folks still dealing with health consequences that are really only just beginning because we really don't know what's coming down the line. It seems like this should be something that should be a no-brainer for folks in the federal government to get behind. I've yet to see it. I hope they get out there and do it and prove me wrong. I'm happy to come on here and commend them if they pass some tough legislation. I'd love to be having that conversation.
If I may too, we read our emails, okay? So, we see what people send us, and I get a lot of constituent mail. I get a lot of constituent emails. I get a lot of things from interest groups. Interestingly, when I have my own legislation out, I talk to my colleagues on the floor and they say, I've been getting emails from people in your district telling me to co-sponsor this bill you just put up. So people pay attention to that. So a lot of people, I feel like, might think their elected officials are not paying attention and don't care. But if this is something that's important to you, email people, call them, call their office, send them things. Because otherwise, like I said, if there are chirping crickets in the background when people talk about an issue, it will just fade into the background. So if this is important to you, make sure that you're asking your senator and your member of Congress and your state rep to work on these issues together. I mean, we all see each other at all the same events and we all talk. So make sure that you reach out to people and don't just send one email and then hope that that'll be that. Keep putting pressure, because unless people keep hearing from people in their community, they may not realize that it's something that's still of interest.
No, I think that's good advice. And I mean, a lot of people, I think, too, put the focus on their like federal representatives, but I think you're going to be more likely to actually get a response back and have more action taken reaching out to a state representative such as yourself. And in a lot of cases, that might not always be true, but I think that's a good piece of advice. Thank you so much, Representative Salisbury, for joining us. Hopefully we can stay in touch on this and keep me updated on any progress that this bill might make through the Senate.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.